Well, thank you very much for the fine introduction. I'm very happy to be at Hillsdale again. It's a wonderful place, and I hope I'll come back even again. I'm going to speak tonight on a very old case called the Nosenko case. We have to go back 6 decades, which is a long time, even for me to go back. But it was a case that defined the CIA, perhaps paralyzed it, and some people think destroyed the old CIA for better or worse. So it's the most important case of the Cold War. Now, I hope you don't mind a little time travel, because I'm going to take you back and forth in time, but only twice or 3 times. First, we're going to go back to November 22nd, 1963, excuse me. We all know John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas. We also know that the alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was shot the next day in a prison, Dallas police station, actually. And, and we know there was a Warren Commission investigation, so we're pretty familiar with that. But what no one knew at the time, and knew for another 15 years, was that there was a crisis developing at the CIA immediately after the assassination. Not everyone in the CIA, but one school of thought in the counterintelligence staff, the research run by a guy called Raymond Rocca. They began developing a theory that the Soviet Union and its leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was behind the assassination, that Khrushchev killed Kennedy, to say it shortly. The theory was based on information that no one else knew. And so I don't get you too excited. The theory didn't prove out. But for one thing, they knew from their intelligence work that Oswald had gone to Russia, spent 2.5 years there, and their sources, which don't mean they're not necessarily accurate, but their sources told them that the KGB had been preparing Oswald as a sleeper agent. Secondly, they knew that Oswald had gone to the Soviet embassy on October 1st, which is roughly 6 weeks before the assassination. But even more intriguing, Oswald had written a letter. In those days, letters were intercepted by a mail cover to embassies. He wrote a letter to the Soviet embassy in Washington talking about, this is 5 weeks before the assassination, talking about a plan and his meeting with a man called Kostov in the Russian embassy. Well, the CIA knew that he was probably referring to Kostenko, probably his name is Kostakov, I got that wrong, Kostakov, who was the head of their assassination bureau called the Department of 13th. They also knew that he had seen in the Russian embassy, they had intercepted correspondence by the NSA, which was able to decode typing going back and forth on cables, that a man called Oleg Negopachenko, I later saw this man, by the way, in Moscow, but that he had written an assessment of Oswald that went back to the KGB. Now, this was not the general opinion or even the opinion of the FBI or anyone. It was a faction in the CIA. But the CIA director, or the person in charge of their covert operations, Richard Helms, who later became the director of the CIA, Richard Helms realized he had a crisis on his hands, or better said, a dilemma. On one hand, he could report this information to the Warren Commission. which then would have to deal with a possible Soviet assassination of an American president. And Helms, as he told me later on, was concerned because the year before, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came very close to a nuclear war with Russia. So the last thing Helms wanted to do was set the stage for a nuclear confrontation. On the other hand, if he kept this information secret, the CIA was a very vicious place back in the 60s and the 70s and maybe even today. He knew that someone would leak it and he'd be accused of suppressing information that could lead to the uncovering of a plot to kill the president. So just as he was tormented by this, we're now January 1964, just after New Year's, suddenly a defector comes from Russia. The defector's name, as I mentioned earlier, was Yuri Nosenko. Yuri Nosenko came with a message. The message was, I was Lee Harvey Oswald's case officer during his 2.5 years in Russia. Moreover, after the assassination, the KGB had me do a complete investigation of all of Oswald's relations with all of the intelligence services of the Soviet Union. And I'm now here to tell you the facts and the truth of the matter. And the fact and the truth is that Soviet intelligence had nothing whatsoever to do with Oswald. They never recruited him, they never trained him. Well, this came as a great relief to Helms, because now he went to Earl Warren, who was, the Warren Commission was named after Chief Justice Warren, and he said, look, we have a defector who tells us that Russia had nothing to do. He's closed, had great amounts of information from the KGB, and he just came over, and we now know, we can now dismiss the idea of Russia involvement. And Warren said, well, that's good, we'll have him testify. And Helms said, well, wait a moment, we haven't checked this man's bona fides. Now in the CIA, if a man's bona fides aren't approved, it means they don't know whether he's still a Russian agent or a dangle who's been sent over to deliver disinformation, or he's legitimate. So Warren was confused by that. He said, you haven't decided that? He said, no, that will take months. And so it's better you don't bring him before the Warren Commission. Okay, so he never appeared before the Warren Commission. He never appeared anywhere. He was essentially deep-sixed. And this was a secret. No one heard his name. No one knew about his role in anything for at least over a decade, up until, let's say, 1978 or 77. So all this time, it was the greatest secret the CIA held, that they had received this defector who had cleared Russia from being involved in the Kennedy assassination. Why it came out in 1978, January 1978, is I published a book called Legend, which revealed the entire case. Now you might ask, how did I ever become involved with Yuri Nosenko, and how did I ever find out about the case? And I'm going to tell you, which we now have to travel in time again to 1976. I was a reporter, a writer at the New Yorker. And the New Yorker had one rule, it had a lot of rules, but one rule that's relevant. You can't do anything for the Reader's Digest. No, I mean, you were fired, basically. I was on the New Yorker staff. And the editor of the Reader's Digest, a wonderful man called Edward Thompson, called me and said, we would like you to do a book for us on the Kennedy assassination. I said, I can't do that. New York would never allow it. He said, well, I have something to tell you. If you agree to do this book, we will provide you with the man who was Oswald's case officer in the KGB in Russia. Now, I had never even heard there was such a man, or that he had a case officer. And he'll tell you the entire story of the Russian involvement. Well, this was something I couldn't turn down, no matter what the New Yorker said. So I agreed. And they delivered, I should say the CIA delivered, Nosenko to me. But what had happened was the CIA, after a defector is useless to them, which happens pretty quick, the next stage is exploiting them for public relations or propaganda, however you want to term it. So with someone like Penkovsky, they write the Penkovsky papers. Peter Derabian wrote the Penkovsky papers, and they put it out under the person's name. And here they wanted to put out the Nosenko story. The Reader's Digest was a natural platform because it had the kind of audience they wanted. I had nothing to do with it, by the way. This is all before I was ever contacted. But the Reader's Digest had a huge internal fight about whether the Washington Bureau would do this or headquarters in Pleasantville would do this. And as a compromise, they just had to get a total outsider. So I entered this as a total outsider. I knew nothing whatsoever about spies or espionage or double agents, dangles, all the terms I was going to come to learn, deception, all that. And they just wanted, I knew something about the Kennedy assassination. They just wanted someone who was unconnected to the Digest to write this book. And the CIA delivered Nosenko. Literally, a CIA officer called Jamie Jameson, who was a part of their division of public exploitation, and was now running Nosenko. Actually, a guy on crutches walks in to the office, the Digest office in Washington, with Nosenko, and he said, "He's all yours." So I thought this was a huge scoop, and in those days I was looking for scoops. So, I began a series of interviews with him, and you can read all about that if you want. My book, Assume Nothing, or if you prefer, I wrote a more lengthy book called Deception on this matter. Any case, well, no matter what and I knew a good deal about the assassination because I had interviewed and was the only person to interview all the members of the Warren Commission and their staff, their lawyers and investigators, and I had all the documents. So I was pretty conversant on that subject. And he seemed to know nothing really about Oswald. All he could say is we had nothing to do with him. And so I didn't know what to do. So I went to the Soviet embassy in Washington. And I thought, well, maybe I can go to Russia and check on some of the people he's named who knew Oswald. And the Russian counsel, a political officer, which is the head of the KGB probably, named called Igor Agu, meets with me, and I say, well, I'd like to go to Russia for this purpose. He said, well, first of all, you don't have to go to Russia because you happen to have right here in Washington the best source on Oswald that we have. I said, who's that? He said, Yuri Nosenko. Now, I found it, why would Yuri Nosenko was supposed to be a traitor. He had defected from Russia. Why would Russia be vouching for his bona fides when even the CIA wouldn't? And so I went back to the Jamie Jameson. He said, no, the guy just didn't know what he was saying. Everyone in the CIA agrees this guy is as good as gold, okay? But I had read a newspaper story in the New York Times about a guy being fired from the CIA called James Jesus Angleton, who was the head of their counterintelligence staff. And he was fired for, I don't know, running a mail cover program or something. He was fired on Christmas Day, 1975, I think. And so I thought, well, very controversial. He's no longer in the CIA. I'll call him. So I asked Jameson for his number. He said, this guy's so secretive. His wife thinks he works for the post office. You would never find, we can never give you his number. So I looked in the phone book. I mean, you know, the phone book is the greatest asset a journalist has.